The goal of this video is to give you an overview on the science portion of the ACT. Many analysts say that just having knowledge about the structure of the science section of the ACT can increase your score. So part of the goal today is just to give you some basic knowledge, and with this alone, your score should go up. But beyond this in chemistry, we're hoping to help you with each of the different passage sections. So first off, the science section is the last section of the ACT. So oftentimes it's the section you are the most tired because you've already done so much. It's a quick one. It's only 35 minutes with 40 questions. So it's not like the math one that's a whole hour long. 35 minutes for 40 questions means you have less than a minute to answer each question. Okay. It's kind of similar to the reading portion in that it's set up with passages. And then 5 to 7 questions after each passage pertaining to the passage as presented. Okay. Different types of passages then the ACT has created are data representation passages, research summary passages, or multiple viewpoint passages. So there's actually different types of passages in terms of what they're trying to test you on. Okay. Biggest thing about the science portion of the ACT is it's called a science reasoning test. So because of that, what they say is you don't need any specific scientific knowledge to necessarily answer the questions. Yes, they say you should have content knowledge through biology in order to answer some of the questions, like it might pull up some previous knowledge, but it's really not based on previous knowledge. It's based on analyzing the information that they present to you. Okay, it's about your ability to reason scientifically, not recreate knowledge that you've already learned scientifically. So some general hints for you, the biggest hints that I can give you. Number one, these passages are going to be about scientific knowledge that you don't contain. Okay, they will be about things you haven't necessarily learned in school. Okay, because of that, though, don't get stuck on the language of what they're saying. They're trying to have you look at the information presented in graphical and data tables and then answer the questions. So potentially there's going to be a study on, how photosynthesis is going to be affected by something. Okay? If what they're looking at is some kind of really advanced language that is tripping you up, don't get stuck on that. Supplement an easy word. Okay? Oh my gosh, I wonder how blue is affecting photosynthesis. Okay, we're looking for the relationships. It doesn't matter if you understand the content so much as be able to pull out the relationships. Okay, so they're going to give you graphs and data tables and pictures of things. And it's all about relating what they're giving. Okay, it's not about understanding. Too many people waste their time trying to understand, and it's not about understanding. Oh, this is about photosynthesis and some topic I don't understand. I noticed that when the thing I don't understand goes up, the amount of photosynthesis also increases. Done. I've figured out the relationship. So general ACT tip actually for every section is the fact that during the ACT, we give you a 5-minute warning. We don't give you like a 1-minute warning. Okay, so I see a lot of people like frantically bubbling and looking at the clock and bubbling and looking at the clock, worried about not finishing. So you don't get punished for wrong answers in the ACT. So you should have every bubble bubbled when you finish at time called. Okay, so what we always recommend is when they do the 5-minute warning, number one, realize you could have a whole passage left because there's a lot of time. I mean, it's only a 35-minute test, so 5 minutes is a whole 1/7 of what you've done. But also at the 5-minute warning, I would recommend marking where you are, bubbling in to the end of the test so that you have all the bubbles answered, and then come back to that last passage, read it, and then answer each question like erasing and bubbling as you go. Okay. The other recommendation we give is to write. Circle, underline, be actively engaged in what you're reading. If you passively read, it's really hard to remember and process. Okay, so just the act of underlining and circling and things like that will help you. My number one tip, oh my gosh, don't try to learn. So I literally have people come out of the ACT sometimes being like, oh, Miss Lee, I can't believe it. I read this passage and I learned that. And I'm like, no, don't learn from the ACT. Okay, just take what's presented and use it to answer the questions. You don't have to understand. You just have to figure out the relationship. Okay, it's not about understanding the science. Okay, just figure out the relationship. So 3 different types of passages. You have a data representation passage is one type. Okay, usually there'll be some kind of like graphs or data tables. What they're trying to see if you can do is understand, evaluate, and interpret the graphs and tables and charts. Okay, about 38% of the test will be this. Number 1, all the text that's given to you, don't waste your time reading it too much. Okay, spend your time on the graphs and the tables. Analyze those. What's the relationship? What are they trying to say? How many trials were there? What is the difference between trial 1 and trial 2? Okay, don't do a lot of reading in the science section. Okay, underline, circle, figure out the relationships of what is being studied, but don't read it. Okay, don't read it. The research summary one, very similar. It's going to have more than one experiment. Again, between the different experiments, either there'll be different people doing the same experiment or different experiments. Okay, again, don't read. We're trying to evaluate that you can understand and interpret results. Okay, so only read the passage to figure out what is being studied, but then again, shift over to the graphs and the tables. How are the tables the same? How are the tables different? What variables are being adjusted? What is the relationship between variables? Anytime you spend understanding what the data being presented to you is before you move to the questions is time well spent. Okay, so spend a little bit of time figuring out like what's being studied. Okay, like what are the variables, how the variables are changing. So like number 1, how do they change in the different studies? And number 2, how are they changing relative to one another? And like write that stuff down and then move into the questions. The third question type, multiple viewpoints, is kind of the most Englishy of all the scientific passages. So this is the only one where you're probably going to have to read. Not a lot of data presented in tables or pictures. I usually, at minimum, read the first, maybe second, and last sentences of each paragraph to make sure I'm getting a sense of what's going on. But you'll recognize this passage usually because there's no data. And again, the goal of these is a multiple viewpoint. So when I'm going to read these, what I'm focusing on is who are they talking about and what are their different viewpoints. So like, oh, if they're talking about global warming, what is each person's viewpoint on global warming, right? So that I understand how they're the same and how they're different. They're the same, they're all talking about global warming. They're different about what they think is causing global warming. Okay, so again, you don't have to read the whole passage, but you do need to identify what the different viewpoints are so you can answer the questions. And then similar to English, during the passages, it might reference you back to specific words or statements, and then you'll have to go back and look at the passages. Answer every questions, right? I already said this. Bubble all the answers in before you get to the end. Always use your educated guessing. One tip I always think work really well on standardized multiple choice tests is when you're given a prompt and you're looking at the different options. If you're not sure, one thing you can do is read each potential answer and say, does this answer actually answer the question? So sometimes they're just kind of, again, they're information that could be pulled from the story, but they don't necessarily support the question being asked. So you can do those educated guesses to kind of cross out some that don't make sense. Okay. I would say that the biggest issues for most people on the science ACT is they take too long. They don't have enough time. And they get bogged down by the language. So biggest thing for people to increase their scores are number 1, to know about the structure of the test, and number 2, to practice the timing. Okay, so you're trying not to spend more than 30 seconds on any question, and you have about 5 minutes per passage. Okay. Then the last little thing is that generally speaking, and this is also true for the reading section, the first couple questions for each passage are easier than subsequent questions. So like the first ones should be more straightforward. So tend to answer those or try to answer those before you move on if you're having a time issue. So that's a general overview of what the Science ACT looks like. Again, it's a science reasoning test. So it's all about analyzing the data and the graphs. That's it for you guys. Have a nice night.